You're all very welcome. My name is Fintan Mullen. I'm the Executive Director of the Ulster Historical Foundation, the publisher of the book. And over here on tech is my colleague Conleth. We'd like to welcome you all to this lecture to help launch the publication of this new book. You're very welcome, and we're delighted you came, given the sun is shining outside, and that doesn't happen too often in this place. So we know we're competing with that. We'd like to thank, I don't assume Stephen Scarf isn't able to make it. Stephen has been struck down with COVID, so I imagine he's not in it. Otherwise, he would usually say a welcome on behalf of the Crony staff, the Public Record staff. I'm assuming no one else has come, so we'll just start. But I would like to acknowledge Crony for the use of the facility. We have a very good relationship with Crony, and we hold many of our events here. And we also help make recordings of the events and then share them to viewers overseas. I would like to introduce Brian, who I imagine many of you know, Brian White, the author of the book, and who will be giving the presentation today in relation to Robb. Brian is a retired Northern Ireland civil servant living in the Dunbound area. He was born in British Columbia, and he spent most of his early years in Ottawa, in Ontario. After completing his schooling in Belfast, he attended the University of Cambridge, where he took a BA in social anthropology, and following retirement, he obtained an MA with distinction in Irish Studies at Queen's University. He also has been published before on a number of occasions in the Ulster Historical Foundation's annual membership journal, the Familia Ulster Genealogical Review, exploring aspects of family history. And it's that deep interest in social and economic history that he has, and he's trying to use that interest to, I suppose, demonstrate how family records can illuminate our study of the past. And he has done that very successfully in his previous Familia articles, and he has done that most definitely in this book, Alexander Robb and the Making of British Columbia. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Fintan. That's very, very kind. I would like to join you in saying my thanks to the Public Record Office for allowing us to use this facility today. I should also in particular thank the Ulster Historical Foundation, Fintan, one of his colleagues, William Ralston, who's done so much to help get this particular publication over the line. There are also people who provided financial support, the BC Genealogical Society that I should mention, the Bayburn Historical Society that I should mention. But there's one person in particular that I would like to talk about very briefly, and that is my mother, Helen White. She celebrated her 103rd birthday at the beginning of last month. She's very frail and sadly unable to be here today. But throughout my life, but more particularly in relation to this particular project of publication, he's given me an enormous amount of support. And for that reason, I am extremely grateful that Conleth here is going to be able to record what I'm saying today. I do hope that she finds it worthwhile when she gets to see it. Well, let's begin. If you'd been on a mountainside in central British Columbia 161 years ago, almost to the day, you might well have encountered 13 tired, disheveled, dispirited, and quite possibly starving young men from County Down. Who were they? What were they doing there? And what happened to them in the immediate aftermath? That's really what I want to talk about today. I'm not going to be talking about all 13. I'm sure you'd be glad to hear. But I do want to concentrate on one of them, well, sorry, four of them in particular. One of them is Alexander Robb. In the interest of full disclosure, I need to point out that he is my great-grandfather. I owe him a considerable amount, and that is not only in terms of genetics, obviously, but thanks to his legacy, I actually am where I am today. People who will know, but for what he had created in his lifetime, I wouldn't be living, for example, in the house I'm living in today. But in addition to Alexander Robb, I'll be focusing on three others, and I will introduce those in due course. The cornerstone, if you like, of the book are letters that my great-grandfather wrote home from North America between the years 1862 and 1873. He wrote these. 3 of them were to his big sister Eleanor, who was in effect the mother of the family. She took over that role after their mother had died shortly after giving birth to twins in 1850. Another 4 were to his father. There was at least one to younger sister Mary, but the rest were to his sister Susie, Susanna, Suki, who obviously was a great favorite of his. She was one of the twins who was born just before their mother had died. Now, these letters I came across first when I was quite a young individual. Needless to say, I was really quite excited by tales of a person living in the wilderness of central British Columbia. But I have come across them later. I revisited them later on, and they do appear in a number of publications. They appear also online in a number of places. But there are errors in them, and I thought, in addition to correcting errors, it might be worth trying to provide a bit of context to those letters. The result is the book, copies of which are on the table at the back. The story focuses on a gold rush. Now, gold rushes were a thing during the 1800s. Perhaps the most famous would have been the California gold rush, which took place in the late 1840s and early 1850s in that area. But by the early 1850s, it was beginning to run out of steam, and the people who had been making money out of the gold rush began to move their way north up the coast to see whether there were any other sources of gold that they could find. The search took them up the coast and eventually to the Fraser River, where gold was discovered in the sandbanks and bars. They pushed ever further up and eventually found themselves in the Cariboo Mountains of central British Columbia, where absolutely stonking quantities of gold were found. Well, needless to say, with the discovery of that magnitude, it was certainly not going to be kept secret. And word of it quickly spread. And stories about the so-called auriferous character of British Columbia began to appear in the press in Great Britain and Ireland. An example of that is a letter which appeared originally in the Times of London in late 1861, but as was the habit in that day, it was shamelessly plagiarized by other newspapers, including, as you will see, the Belfast Morning News, and dare I say it, also the Belfast Newsletter in January of 1862, written by a correspondent of the Times, actually a businessman living on Vancouver Island, who was obviously trying to increase his trade. It was full of the most wonderful news. He talked about the almost fabulous richness of the mines. He talks about accounts where men were making $100 per day, and not a few picked up 100 ounces in the same space of time. Think, he said, of $100 to the pan, not a fancy but a reality. Miners think that richer diggings are yet to be found. Now, it's always difficult making a comparison in terms of the value of money at that time in the past. There are at least 3, probably more, ways that can be done. One is to look at the comparative cost of labor in the 2 periods. And if you apply that metric to the $100 in the pan, you get a figure. Well, a couple of years ago, you would have got a figure of £14,400. With recent inflation, it may well have gone up slightly. Needless to say, news of a gold discovery of this kind in British Columbia sparked interest. And it certainly sparked interest in this group of 13 young men from County Down who headed west. Well, who were they? Who went to British Columbia? They can be divided into two main groups. I should say, those are the ones that I have information about. There are quite a number, at least four, that I don't have very sketchy information about. But where I am aware of the individuals, two groups. The first group centered around Crawfordburn, between Bangor and Hollywood. You can see the names of the men there. Probably all members of the Ballygilbert Presbyterian congregation, but I think in terms of what they were planning, it may well be significant that I do believe that all of them, most if not all of them, would have attended primary school together in Crawfordsburg. So a number of them would have been good friends for quite a while. There were two brothers in the group, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice John McDowell Greenfield and William John McDowell. Yes, indeed, they were first cousins. And I suspect that if we had more information about the family trees of the people, we would see that there were other relationships, maybe second or third cousin. There were certainly, I know, relationships of marriage between these different group of people. I heard an expression in another part of the country talking about an area where people were through other interbred like rabbits. And maybe that's a bit unfair to the people of North Down, but it was a particularly close-knit community in terms of relationships by kin and marriage. So to that extent, perhaps the other three men living just north of Killalay, Hugh Boyd, the two McCleary brothers, Fitzgerald and Samuel, are outliers. They lived on adjacent farms beside the Clay Lakes. But if I were to tell you that Hugh Boyd was the first cousin of the Pattons of Ballygrot, I might have to explain how those three became engaged in this enterprise. And indeed, it is those three people, as well as my great-grandfather, Alexander Robb, that I want to say a little bit more about today. I show the names of four others, basically to ask if anybody has information about them. I'd be very grateful to receive it. I can't even place John Robb, even though I know there were, it was quite a common name in the Newton Ards area at that time. Well, what more can we say about this group? I think the two things I draw attention to. The first is that these people were not impoverished by any stretch of the imagination. All of them would have been living on farms which would have been regarded as large, certainly by County Down standards, where farms tended to be slightly smaller than many other places in Ireland. All of them had farms, all that I'm aware of, would have come from farms of 50 acres plus. Some of them actually came from really very large farms. Stewart, 74 acres, McDowell, 83 acres. Alexander Robb, at that stage, his family had 130 acres around Dundonald. And we're not talking about marginal land here. And if the Pattons of Ballygrot were at the other end of the spectrum, farming about 50 acres, I think it's worth pointing out that their father also had a construction business and a building, a contracting business and a construction business. So to that extent, farming was an adjunct to another source of income, which leads me, I think, to my second point about this group of people. Living within the triangle between Bangor, Newton Ards, and Belfast, there were actually plenty of commercial opportunities which intelligent young men with a bit of education could have aspired to. I know that at least one of them attended commercial college in in Belfast, others may have done the same. So there were opportunities to be had in Belfast. If not in Belfast, there were opportunities in Great Britain as well for people with their background. So they were not being forced away from these shores. Now, it's very easy to say, well, you know, of course they left because they had pound signs in their eyes. They thought that they would get fabulous riches. I think there's a certain truth to that, but there were certainly, I do not think, being dulled or misled by the stories of wealth on the far side of the Atlantic. And I think a couple of points I'd make in relation to this. The first is, it would seem that the enterprise had been in planning possibly for a period of time. I know, for example, that my great-grandfather went to the West Coast armed with letters of introduction to people who were in San Francisco. It may well have been that they'd been thinking of going to California. I know also that the Cleary brothers were probably aware that their mother's brother, a person that we will encounter later in this talk, Hugh McRoberts, had been in Australia, but had moved to California, and by 1858 was in British Columbia. So they weren't entirely ignorant about what was going on the other side of the world. But the other clincher, I think, is symbolized by this rather fine clipper ship, which used to ply, making record runs between Australia and Liverpool, a ship called the Lightning. In 1859, it had arrived back in Liverpool with another group of County Down men, this time men who'd been in Australia, men coming back with £1,500, each with £1,500 worth of gold figuratively in their pockets. Again, difficult to make the comparison, but for £1,500, think 1.5 million in terms of modern currency. So they weren't short of a ball when they came back. And indeed, one of them, who is the older brother of my great-grandfather, used his little nest egg to acquire the tenancy of a very nice farm near Ballywalter. Another of them, and this again may be significant in the story, acquired a farm a couple of miles south of Killalay. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, stories were coming from BC about money, but these young men in County Down had seen others coming back from Australia with their fortunes made. And I suspect they thought, look, this is our chance. The views from British Columbia, what's happening there? This is our chance to make our fortune. The difficulty was the circumstances that they were about to encounter in British Columbia were entirely different from the circumstances that had been encountered by the others in Australia. Nevertheless, that letter had appeared in January 1862. By the end of February, they had left Belfast and taken a steamer on the 2nd of March to the West Indies. A few months later, 10,000 miles later, 5 steamships later, 1 steam train, because they took a train across the Isthmus of Panama. They were in New Westminster in the new colony of British Columbia. And that is when they probably got the first inkling that things might not be all that they expected. They were told on the 2nd of May that it was probably too early to go into the Cariboo Mountains. It's too early in the season, and the thaw wasn't sufficiently advanced to make that move. The next step was their last, I suppose, relatively easy bit. 95 miles in a paddle steamer up the Fraser River to Fort Yale, where the Fraser enters the Fraser Gorge, and navigation, certainly in those days, became absolutely impossible. From Fort Yale, the boys had a walk of 400 miles on foot. On the map here, you can see Yale. Their route would have taken them along that dotted line, which I hope you can see, as far as Kenelmouth, the present day town of Kenel. That follows the line of the Cariboo wagon road, which parts of which were in the process of being built at that time. That final stretch between Kenelmouth and Barkerville didn't exist, as indeed Barkerville didn't exist. So they were actually took the final bit up the Canal River and into the mountains in that area there. They accomplished the last 50 miles or so, starting with packs of 90 pounds on their back. The conditions they encountered on that final stretch were absolutely atrocious: mud, snow, even at that late time, swamp and forest. Slightly whimsical picture on the left-hand side, showing a miner on his way up and a miner, his alter ego, on the way down, looking slightly more tattered and with his hand out looking for arms. My great-grandfather's comment was that the sensible thing that they should have done on arriving in the mines was to immediately have sold all their supplies and retraced their steps. But why was that? Well, the first thing I want you to do is to get out of your head a kind of whimsical picture that this is what a gold rush is all about. Bearded man with his pan, dipping his pan into a crystal clear mountain stream and extracting large quantities of gold. That certainly was not the case. This is more like it. The diggings were how to put it, certainly a semi-industrial affair. I'm going to show you a number of pictures here, taken a year or so after my great-grandfather was in the diggings, when some of the works presumably were further advanced. But these were the sorts of works that people were attempting to achieve while he was there. Basically, the problem in the Cariboo was water. When it was frozen, you couldn't do any work. And when it wasn't frozen, it could be a nuisance, but it was also essential. The gold in the Cariboo is so-called placer gold, which means it's alluvial gold. It's to be found in ancient and modern stream beds. And the whole trick about finding gold is either, sometimes you're lucky enough to find it on the surface, but being able to make an intelligent guess about where a stream bed might have been in times past. So that involved either taking water away from a place so you can work at it, which you can see in this picture, or taking water to places where we'd use them either to power equipment or to help you wash the gold. There was also a system of mining called hydraulicking, where you used water to blast away at gravel banks with high pressure jets of water, and then you tried to clean gold out of the slurry. In some places you were digging down into the old stream beds. Here is the shaft entrance of the so-called never sweat tunnel. And again, another method of getting your dirt up from under the ground. Here, a so-called Cornish mill, or Cornish wheel roller. At the time, what happened was that miners would typically organize themselves into groups of 4 to 8 men on adjacent claims of land and work at it. One of the men that my great-grandfather encountered, a chap from Crawfordsburg by the name of Bill McWall, said that he and 7 other men had been working for 8 weeks on their claims, and it would be at least another 3 weeks before they got any return. Sounds bad enough, but when you think about the cost of sustaining that operation, it was absolutely horrendous. Particularly the price of food. A meal in a boarding house would cost 10 shillings. A cup of coffee, my great-grandfather paid 2 shillings for a cup of black coffee. So when you think say the equivalent of £36 shilling, a meal in a boarding house costing £360, gives you an indication that trying to sustain an operation of 8 men for 8 weeks was going to run through any capital that you had extremely quickly. The reason for this was that there had been a very bad winter in Oregon the winter before, which meant that cattle, which otherwise would have been driven north, were in short supply and arrived late. The situation was made worse by the fact that a lot of the pack animals, which otherwise would have been taking food into the mountains, actually had on them prospective miners who had managed to pay more than others to acquire an easy ride into the diggings. And also, perhaps inevitably, given the influx of Europeans into the area, there was a very serious outbreak of smallpox amongst the native population, and people who might otherwise have been available for portering weren't there. So extremely costly. Just as an aside, a pair of gumboots would cost you, and given the conditions, absolutely essential. A pair of gumboots would cost you the equivalent of about £4,000. The men from County Down seemed to split up quite soon after they arrived in the area. Quite a sensible decision. And then one by one, they began to drift away. And this leads us on to Hugh McRoberts, who I mentioned earlier, uncle of the Cleary brothers. He'd been in Australia, gone to California, arrived in British Columbia in 1858, and presumably by that stage had reasoned that the best way to make money out of a gold rush is not to look for gold, but to provide ancillary services. He got a contract to build a road along the Fraser Canyon for 15 miles north of Yale. And the British Columbia government, being skint at the time, paid him partially in money, but also in promissory scrips for land, scrips which he could use to exchange for government land elsewhere in British Columbia. And this takes us back down the Fraser River to its mouth. I will home in on the area of interest. Now, some of you I know will have been to Vancouver. If you have, you will have landed there on Sea Island, which is where Vancouver International Airport is today. You can look away, but you will not be able to find Vancouver in this map. It hadn't actually been, hadn't been invented then, but Vancouver eventually was to grow up with its nucleus here on the south of Burrard Inlet. But to try and orientate you in terms of modern times, Vancouver is roughly in this area, Burnaby here, Surrey here, and Richmond on Lulu Island and Sea Island here. New Westminster, which you can see laid out in city lots, was the only sizable centre of population at that time. Hugh McRoberts used his land scrips to buy 1,600 acres of land on Sea Island. I really can't imagine what that would cost, well, what it would be worth nowadays, but you're talking 1,600 acres. I think that's what, 2.5 square miles, is it? It's a sizable amount of land. But in addition to the land, he also seems to have wangled a contract to build a road from New Westminster to a place near his holding. That is now the line of Marine Drive. And when they arrived back, presumably tails between their legs from the diggings, Fitzgerald and Samuel McCleary and their chum Hugh Boyd got work building that road. This slide perhaps gives an indication what road building was like. On the left, we see Marine Drive at an early stage. The picture on the right is not Marine Drive, but gives you an indication of what sort of country was being driven through to create a road. Now, think that is all being done with axes, saws, oxen, and horses. and maybe the odd bit of explosives. People at the time used to complain that contractors didn't take the verges of the roads back far enough. But you can perhaps see why they were reluctant to do so. It didn't do the contractors any harm, certainly Hubert Roberts, because after building Marine Drive, he also had the contract for keeping it clear when trees fell across the road after bad storms. So, Sea Island, you can see in this map being referred to as McRoberts Island, which name that was interchangeable at the time. You can see the place where McRoberts started to farm, Richmond View. In the autumn of that year, though, the two McClearys preempted in what you see there as the Garden of Eden. And in so doing, they became the first non-Indigenous people to settle within what are now the city boundaries of Vancouver. That is one of their main claims to fame. Now, I should say a little bit about what preemption is, what it meant. Under British Columbia law, at that time, a British subject or a person prepared to swear allegiance to the Crown could go out onto government land armed with 4 stakes, drive them into the 4 corners of a rectangle of 160 acres, and go along to an office nearby and pay 8 shillings and register it. And effectively, it gave them reasonably good title at that time. That might sound like an absolutely splendid deal, and in a way it was. What had happened basically was the British Columbia government wanted to encourage agriculture, but didn't have enough money to undertake the kind of survey which might have been taken place elsewhere, which normally would have preceded land grants of this kind. So basically, they privatized it. They put it out to self-help. 2 wrinkles. One was that in due course, when the land did come to be surveyed, dear knows when that would be, there was a further sum of money to pay, 4 shillings and 6pence an acre. But in the meantime, to fully secure your title, you had to work to the equivalent of, or do improvements, I should say, to the equivalent of 10 shillings an acre on your land. Now that could be all sorts of things. That could include building a house, taking down trees, clearing the land, building dikes, cutting ditches, building fences. But although this might strike you as being quite a good deal, if you didn't have capital behind you, again, it was extremely difficult. And I think it is almost certain that the Cleary brothers had help from their uncle in terms of preparing their preemptions. Their uncle would have had oxen. He certainly had a boat, and all these things would have been useful to them. This is the McCleary's preemption, a rather wet Garden of Eden, a picture taken after a flood. It wasn't flooded all the time, I'd like to point out. Though I include this picture partially out of interest, because if you look at the old Ordnance Survey map of the townland of Clay, you will see that the farm of the McClearys has written on it land liable for flooding. So the McClearys obviously had experience working on flooded land, not so much out of the frying pan and into the fire as perhaps out of the puddle and into the pond. Another brief aside, this is a picture of Fitzgerald McCleary and Samuel and their 2 sisters. These pictures were taken in Belfast in late February 1862. In fact, the day before they left to go to England. And I think it's rather nice to think of them spending the last day before they departed with their sisters and being prepared to spend some money on a keepsake for their families at home. Fitzgerald certainly had his head screwed on financially. In 1863 or perhaps 1864, he went south to Oregon, came back with cattle, set up a dairying business, and was soon selling dairy products to the burgeoning town of New Westminster. Later on, as their farm developed, he was able to sell hay and other farming produce to the lumber camps that were springing up around the shoreline, the coast of British Columbia. He did reasonably well, as you can see from this photograph. On the left, you can see the preemption in slightly drier conditions, and on the right, the house that he was able to build after he'd been working the land for a number of years. As a point of interest, this is a very nice piece of land. Later on in his life, he was approached by a couple of Vancouver businessmen who wanted to buy his farm in order to turn it into a golf course. Fitzgerald, being a good Presbyterian, declined to do so on the grounds that people might play golf on the Sabbath day. So, if you want to hear the sound of a McCleary spitting in his grave, I suggest you go to Vancouver at the current time and visit the McCleary golf course on his land and visit it on a Sunday. Hugh Boyd, perhaps a bit more technical, and I think it's an indication that the so-called free land of a preemption is not really free. He works with the McClearys and McRoberts in 1862, and there are various sightings of him over the next few years. He had a mining license in the Cariboo in 1864, but I know that both before that and after, in 1863, I think it was, he was building a street in New Westminster. In 1865, he was contract ploughing on Lulu Island, which is the island adjacent to Sea Island. He obviously had difficulty getting the capital together that would have been needed to farm. But in 1866, in conjunction and partnership with a Scotsman called Alexander Kilgore, the two of them set up a farm, Rosebrook Farm, on Sea Island. He did sufficiently well. He married Marianne McCall, I should say, who is the daughter of a Royal Engineer, a member of the detachment of Royal Engineers that had been dispatched to British Columbia to keep it out of American hands in 1858. Their son was only the second white child to be born, quotes, on these islands, on Sea Island and Lulu Island. For some reason, in 1886, he sold up his share of the property, returned to Ireland. He lived for a time in around Ballyhackamore, but subsequently lived in a house called Richmond and Osborne Park, Bangor, and he's subsequently buried in the graveyard in Dundonald. His claim to fame, though, is the fact that he has a high school named after him in what is now Richmond, British Columbia. It came about in this way. In 1879, a number of the worthies on Sea Island and Lulu Island decided the time had come for them to create a municipality, and they did so in 1879, with the elections being held in 1880. During these elections, Hugh Boyd was elected so-called warden of the municipality. That's an office which subsequently is the equivalent of a mayor nowadays. So he was, in effect, the first mayor of Richmond, British Columbia. Now, if I tell you the polling station was on Sea Island and more, the polling station was in the Kilgore Boyd residence on Sea Island. And furthermore, Mrs. Boyd apparently spent the day busy making cups of tea and providing buns. It's perhaps unsurprising that her husband helped the poll. Whatever, he certainly, I don't know where the polling station were afterwards, but he managed to do that afterwards as well. But as I say, he returned. He held office until he returned to Ireland in 1886. Briefly now, my great-grandfather, his trajectory, if you like, was similar to that of Boyd. After he left the Cariboo, he didn't go as far south, but he ended up working on a stretch of the Cariboo wagon road that was being built in central British Columbia. And I know as well, he did a number of odd jobs about the place. One in particular is of interest. He was involved in building the flume to a sawmill on the north shore of Burrard Inlet, a picture of which you can see here. This was the first edifice, the first building, if you like, on the north shore of Burrard Inlet, and formed the nucleus of what is now the municipality of North Vancouver. But like Boyd, he does seem to have done a number of different jobs until our focus moves to the Nicola Valley, which you can see here, Nicola Lake, Nicola and Kilchenna. In 1868, he and an Englishman called Edwin Daly arrived at the foot of the lake and preempted land. Now, the interesting thing is that, and I should say that these are the first people in the first preemption, the first settlement in the Nicola Valley. The interesting thing, though, is that my great-grandfather was not preempting in his own right. He was actually acting as the agent of the bearded gentleman that you can see on the left, a chap called John Clapperton, a Scotsman who hailed from Queen's County in Ireland. He'd been hired as an agent to kick off the preemption, but he very quickly decided to move on and formed a partnership with a Canadian by the name of Florian Mickle, the bearded gentleman on the right. Florian was a blacksmith and had famously gone to the Cariboo overland from what was then Canada over the Rockies in 1861. But presumably he had some money behind him. He had a trade as a blacksmith, and that would have been quite a remunerative trade in central British Columbia at that time. So I don't know if you call it a match made in heaven, but certainly Florian Mickle had capital, but didn't have experience of farming. My great-grandfather certainly had experience of farming, and together they carved out two preemptions side by side, which they worked together. Now, this is a modern day picture, and I need to just say, although I might be biased, I think that my great-grandfather chose extremely well. Basically, this area is the land that he preempted. Splendid piece of land, certainly in the context of the area, watered by Kilchenna Creek on the left-hand side here, and watered also by Robb's Creek on the right-hand side. In a recent winter, there was enough water coming down from the hills Ulster was standing on to keep this land watered. It's a fair bit of work keeping it irrigated, but it was quite remunerative when we were able to do so. So as things moved on into the 1870s, he was doing quite nicely, thank you. And things got even better in 1873 when he was appointed he got on the provincial or the colonial government payroll and was appointed as the road tax collector, in effect the rates collector for the area. Now that doesn't sound very grand, but the person responsible for collecting the road tax was also the person responsible for overseeing roads in the area. And at that time, a road was being built from Nicola Lake to the Cariboo Wagon Road on the Thompson River. I think about 50 miles or so, 80 kilometers, 50 miles of road for which he was responsible. A nice earner. In 1874, he got $600 for his pains. And given the shortage of cash that there was perpetually in central British Columbia at that time, it was a nice earner to have. So why then in 1874 did he sell his land, and why in 1875 did he return? to Ireland? Simple answer is in 1874, a younger brother who had been earmarked to take over the farm had died of tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was a terrible scourge at that time. We have people here today from Newton Arts. Might be surprised to know that in around that time in the mid-1870s, something like 15% of all the deaths in the Newton Arts registry area were being caused by TB, 15%. And there was a period in Belfast in 1875, the last quarter of 1875, over a third of the deaths recorded were from tuberculosis. It was absolutely rampant at the time. And I think you can see from that picture that Andrew Robb, earmarked to take over the farm, was not looking a well man. When he died, the word came out for my great-grandfather to return and take over the farm. Possibly not the best time to be coming back to Ireland. He arrived back in time to face land law agitation, the Home Rule movement. He was also back in time to face what has been referred to as, began in the late 1870s, the Great Depression in British agriculture. So it was not the easiest path to navigate forward. However, he seems to be reasonably successful. He married Jane Finlay in 1882. He had 4 girls and 3 boys. He was sufficiently well off, probably by selling fresh milk into the Belfast market, to build the very large house that you can see here, which used to stand at the corner of Robb's Road and Newton Arts Road until it was torn down, I think in the late 1980s. So he did well. I'm coming to the end now, and I don't want to draw any great morals from this. And I'm very conscious that this has been quite a quick scamper over events in British Columbia. And I haven't touched on a number of issues which I think are extremely pertinent. There's no doubt, and you've seen from the photographs, the amount of environmental degradation that was involved in gold mining, for example. I talked about people going out and staking claims to government land. Well, we all know how the government acquired that land from native peoples. I haven't talked about that. I haven't said anything about the role of women in this talk, and a very important part that they had to play in both here and in British Columbia. But perhaps there's one thought that I wish to leave you with. It's quite clear, as I said earlier, well, these boys probably left these shores to go to British Columbia with pound signs in their eyes. But when they were disappointed, they didn't allow themselves to be completely disheartened. They were quite prepared to knuckle down and make the very best of the circumstances in which they found themselves. And I think they suffered or undertook hardship, which we find quite unimaginable nowadays, stuck to it and actually laid the foundations for much of the world that we see today. For ill, yes, but I think also for good. So thank you very much for coming here today. And obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Does anybody have any questions for Brian?
Is Alexander Robb, there's a detail in your book, the research or any other way, is he a descendant or relation of John Robb of Newton Arts, the developer of the store in Belfast?
There's no firm record of that. So no, we can't actually make a connection between the Robbs of the store and our Robbs. The family story is that a number of brothers came across from Scotland at the same time. And I'm morally certain that at least some of the Robbs, there were a number of Robbs in the Newton Ards area, were from that family. And indeed, there were Robbs who went to Nova Scotia, who it would seem we can establish a genetic connection through DNA, who came from just north of Newton Ards, but we cannot establish a paper connection.
Okay. Is there still a connection with the Robb family and Ballycilla? Is there any historical connection there today?
Are there any Robbs at Ballycilla now?
No. The original records that I have researched to do with the Robb family, I am the Ballycilla.
Oh yeah, he was Alexander Robb. I wasn't clear about this. Was born in Ballycilla, and the family lived in Ballycilla until 1852, when Alexander Robb's father, also Alexander. One of the confusing things about family history is the fact that all the Robbs are called Alexander. All the important Robbs are called Alexander. His father, born in 1800, acquired Ballybean in Dundonald in 1852, and an aunt of my great grandfather carried on the farming there after the family moved to Dundonald.
One final question then, is there anything in Ballycilla today that would associate the Robb family to Ballycilla?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment. You can still see there's an old farmhouse in Ballycilla, actually, where my great grandfather's wife's family, the Finleys, lived. It can still be seen, but no, I'm not aware of anything in particular that can be seen that could tie in the family to the area. Apart from the old gravestone in Bangor Abbey, in which Robb Ballycilla is clearly marked.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well done. Perhaps you'd like to speak to Brian individually if you have any queries, but I could just come over. Brian, if you have a question, please holler it out. But if you don't, we'll bring proceedings to an end. I'd like to thank Brian again for an absolutely wonderful lecture. It was fascinating talk, and explaining the rigours of the gold mining, because I think we all do have a rather romanticised idea of it in our minds. It sounds and looks absolutely ghastly. Also, I want to compliment you on the quality of your slides, Brian. They're absolutely first class. They're so professional, and you carried the story along so well through the slides. A wonderful presentation all round. And just on that, often at launch, you're thanking people like the designer, and would like to thank her, Jill Morrison, and other people who helped get the book across the line, like my colleague William Rolston. But the person who doesn't get enough thanks at these events is the author himself for the hard work that they do. So for the lecture, and congratulations on the publishing of the book, if you would join me again and give him back. Before you go your separate ways, just to say that the lecture is being recorded, that's my comments here, and it will be made available soon on the internet via probably YouTube or one of our screencast channel, and we'll share that link with anybody who's interested, including those who are here today or anybody you might know who couldn't come today. And of course, there are people who will be watching in when it goes online overseas, a lot of people in Canada who wanted to obviously hear the lecture too. So your presentation today will also have a life of its own after the event now. Can I just also remind everybody that the best way to support the author and the publisher is to buy the book. So if you would like to purchase a copy of the book before you leave, we'd be very happy to relieve you of some money. And we have a special offer today on Brian's book. You can buy Brian's book for 15 quid, but you can buy Brian's book and another book on Ulster immigration to Canada on another individual, Wilson Benson, and the two you can buy together for £20. So that's a really nice offer for you. Thanks again for coming today. We really appreciate it. We were joined last minute. I don't know if he wants to say anything at this stage, but Stephen Scarponi has been able to make it. If not, Stephen, we'll leave it there. Thanks again for coming, and goodbye.